Thank you. Good afternoon, members, and welcome to this meeting of the Ad Hoc Waste Subcommittee, which is being live streamed and recorded. The recording will be made available on the Council website for public listening. Could I remind members to follow the good practice guidance, which includes muting microphones and switching off their video when not addressing the meeting. Should you wish to contribute to any item, you should write "speak" in the Teams chat function, and you will be invited to speak in order about new issues. Should your question or issue be raised by a previous speaker, please withdraw your request so that we can deal with the business as efficiently as possible. The usual standing orders apply, including any votes will be undertaken by roll call. If any member has to leave the meeting for any reason, can I remind you to either leave the Teams meeting for that period of time, or could you write in the Teams chat function and then join? This will allow us to monitor member presence. Could I ask the clerk for the said written apologies, please?
Thank you. Afternoon, members. We've got 9 members present, 2 members not present at the start of the meeting, being Councillor Scobie and Councillor Tate. I don't have any formal apologies, Chair.
Thank you, Tracy. Do any members have any declarations of interest?
Just to say, Chair, it's Ronnie Tate here. I'm in.
Right. Thank you, Ronnie. I take it there's no declarations of interest. Thank you. Could we have the minute of the previous meeting for noting? Agree.
Happy to note, Chair.
Right, thanks. Thanks, Ian. Can we go on to the number 4 is the Waste Service Development of Waste Strategy report by the Head of Roads and Infrastructure. This report provides members with a presentation on the proposed development of a waste strategy. James MacLeod is here to introduce Nick Hughes-Roberts of Recyclable Consulting, who will lead on the presentation. James and Nick are happy to take questions on the presentation and the report once we have the presentation. Right, thank you. Up to you, James.
Thank you, Councillor Martin. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Yes, I would be grateful if we could turn off cameras, if that's possible, please, so that when we put the presentation up on the screen, we can all see that. I think Abby Byrne, AV Tech, still has a screen up as well. Could that be taken down?
That's the one that goes live.
All right. Okay, I've seen that. Seen that filling up the whole of my screen. Okay. So, Nick, are you able to bring up the presentation on the screen, please?
Yeah, sure.
Thank
See
you.
if we can work out technology.
Okay, I'll do a couple of introductory slides to the presentation that's principally been pulled together by Nick, and then a brief introduction for Nick. So, Nick, if you want to jump onto the first slide, if that's possible, please. Yeah. So, just a sort of brief introduction, a recap of where we've been, excuse me, where we've been with the waste service over the last couple of years. November 2018 was the termination of the waste PFI contract. And that's led to all waste services being delivered in-house by the council. So that's the waste collection service, which was in-house, and obviously the waste treatment and disposal service, including the household waste recycling centres. The council's waste services, as I said, currently comprises the curbside collections, the bulky uplift service, commercial collection service, which is required by legislation, the 12 household waste recycling centres across the region, 4 transfer stations, which are 3 transfer stations, I should say, and one and the MBT based at Dumfries, and in the order of about 170 staff within the service across the region. So in 2019, following the termination of the PFI contract, there was a strategy team established to develop a new curbside collection service principally. There was the forerunner to this committee, this subcommittee, a waste subcommittee established as well. And during 2019, we saw transformation events and community conversations taking part, looking at opportunities within the waste service and engaging on the new collection service that was proposed. Retendering of the offtakes from the Echo Deco MBT facility on the Loch Moss significantly reduced the volumes to landfill. And you'll also remember at the beginning of 2019, there was the cessation of the task and finish working arrangements for the waste collection crew. 2020, obviously the main focus of 2020 was the COVID pandemic, which still continues. During that time, we continued to deliver services and we implemented a new booking system for household waste recycling centres. The waste collection, treatment and disposal service, along with the strategy, all merged into one single team under one manager. That unfortunate person being me, or maybe time for the investment in the Dumfries Zero Waste Park. We purchased 150,000 new wheelie bins and 26 new refuse collection vehicles. We rolled out the new curbside collection service in Wigtonshire, and we continued a strong working relationship with Zero Waste Scotland, with comms colleagues and with the education service, which you'll be aware of, led to, for example, the naming of the refuse collection vehicles earlier this year. In 2021, we've seen this new waste subcommittee established. We've seen the completion of the curbside rollout and the new RCV fleet and new food waste vehicles, including 2 electric RCVs, are now in. Well, the food waste vehicles aren't in operation, that will come, but the new RCV fleet is, including the 2 electric RCVs, is in operation across the region. And within the sort of next steps of 2021, we're looking to roll out the food waste service for the remaining 5 towns. So that's Dumfries, Dalbeattie, Lockerbie and Gretna, in addition to Stranraer, where we already operate that service, and that should be happening in, or will be happening in, September, October 2021. We're currently in the process of getting literature out in this regard. Submission of bids to the Recycling Improvement Fund should be scheduled for this month as well, and commencement of this policy and strategy development for the waste service, which is obviously kind of kicking off today with this session with yourselves in Waste Subcommittee. So before I hand over, just a brief introduction to Nick. Nick Hughes-Roberts of Recyclable Consulting as an independent advisor to waste management teams and local authorities in a number of local authorities across the country. As a chartered waste manager, has 20 years of experience, or over 20 years of experience working in the sector, assisting local authorities to identify areas where waste services can be enhanced and efficiency savings could be achieved. So without any further kind of delay from me, I'll hand over to Nick, who will take the session further forward in terms of how we would like to develop a strategy, a policy and strategy for the waste service. Thanks for that, Nick.
Thanks, James. Okay, so I'll just run through the agenda for the rest of this presentation so you know what to expect. So we've just covered the introduction. James has done that for us. I wanted to have a little look and just take a step back and look at where you are right now and have a look at some of the waste metrics and try and put them into context of what's happening around you. We'll do that and then we'll have a little pause for any questions, discussion, feedback that you might have from that bit of the session. Then we'll have a look at where we think you need to be. So what are the national and local drivers and what does that mean for you as a council moving forward? We'll pause again after that because there's quite a bit to talk about and where you need to be. So we'll pause for some more discussion after that. Then we'll look at how you could get to where you need to be. What are the kind of things that you might need to be looking at? What's the general overall approach? Rather than looking at specific initiatives, this is more about the approach to how you get to where you need to be once we've identified exactly where that is. Then we'll look at why we believe a waste policy and waste strategy can help with this and help the council to get to where it needs to be. And then again, we'll have some more discussion and feedback at the end. And I'd encourage any questions and feedback to come through in those sessions wherever they can, just so that we can take away from this the things that are on your minds and we can give them some consideration and think about what that means for the next steps. So let's have a look at where the council is now and let's have a look at some of your recent performance in some of the metrics. It's not going to be too techy, but hopefully should be reasonably easy viewing. So what we can see when we look at the last 3 years worth of data is that there are some positive trends coming out of that. Firstly, we start to see that the overall amount of waste that you are collecting, having deposited at your HWLCs and having to handle is reducing. That's one of the best things that can happen really overall. Reducing the amount of waste that's generated means that there's less overall environmental impact associated with these materials. So you can see over the 3 years there, 2018 through to 2020, it generally decreases, and we've got a trend line showing that sort of overall total waste generated. We can then also look at that as waste generated, sorry, I've just gone too far, as waste generated per person. And that's a really useful indicator because it strips out any element of population growth. And we can see by that again, that trend is showing through. So we think that's a genuine decrease in the waste. If we then move on to recycling rates, we see similar trends. Things are going in the right direction in that we're increasing the amount of waste which you're recycling each year. So it's relatively small increases, but it is at least going in the right direction, and trend line shows that. We can also look at waste to landfill, which is not the inverse of recycling rate, but it is definitely linked to recycling rates. And we can see really significant drops in that amount of material. That is largely due to the reprocurement of the MBT offtake contracts, which diverted that material away from landfill and into more useful recovery processes. So thinking about how much waste each household generates, we did just see some numbers for D&G on there. So we'll show that number on this graph. So this is telling us that each household generates around about 512 kilograms of waste per person per year. That's waste which comes into your waste system. They may produce waste which goes through other systems such as commercial if they have, for example, hired a skip. But this is likely to represent the majority of household waste. So do we think that is higher or lower than the Scottish average? You might be able to post some comments to see what kind of information you think that might be at the moment. Just pause for a second in case anyone wants to do that. Apologies, I can't see with the slideshow whether anyone is doing that, so I'll just give it a moment. Okay, so Scotland comes in at less. As an average across the country, only 440 kilograms is produced per household per year. So that's suggesting that Dumfries and Galloway is a little way behind in terms of overall waste reduction. Now, there are quite often local demographic functions within local authorities that you can't change that just end up with you producing more waste per person. And I think Dumfries and Galloway is a very rural area, and rural areas tend to produce more of certain types of waste, which we might see in there. For example, more garden waste. So it could be explained mostly just by that phenomenon. So how does this then compare to other UK nations? We'll just click through these and we can see England is quite low at 331. Northern Ireland is higher at 531. And Wales is somewhere in the middle at 478. So let's have a think about the same thing for recycling rates. We looked at some recycling rates earlier on for Dumfries and Galloway, and it was showing for 2019, it was showing 29.5%. How do you think that compares to the rest of Scotland? Again, I'll just give you a few moments in case you want to post anything in the comments. So Scotland as a whole comes in at almost 45%. So that's totting up the average of all local authorities, or the sum of all of the weight of waste in all local authorities across Scotland. And of that, 45% is recycled. If we compare that to the other nations, we see that England is slightly higher. Northern Ireland are a little bit higher again. And Wales are way out in front, which is actually quite an interesting comparison, because certainly England's waste management tends to be a little more controlled locally by local authorities and a little less influenced by government. Whereas I think Wales and Northern Ireland and Scotland are generally a little more prescriptive about what they want doing within the waste sector. And certainly in Wales's event, they have had very strong measures in place for about 10 years, and it's really resulted in a huge increase in recycling. Okay, so just to give a quick graphical summary of what the recycling rate looks like in Dumfries and Galloway compared to other authorities within Scotland. Don't expect you to absorb all the information. It's more just to give the context of roughly the range of recycling performances. And you may note that where the recycling rates are particularly low is generally either an island or is Glasgow. We can also present that on a map, and Suez and Lichfield helpfully have done this for us. So I've just cribbed their little document here, which just presents this fairly crude 10% range colour banding chart of Northern Ireland, Scotland, and some of Northern England on here. And you can see where sort of highlights quite starkly, perhaps overly starkly, where Dumfries and Galloway is, but it's nonetheless reasonably clear that in comparison to most of mainland Scotland, it's slightly behind, Glasgow being the only other exception, really. So we can also look at this in terms of CO2, which is becoming more and more important. And we're looking at this focusing on waste issues specifically. So what is the CO2 impact of the waste that each individual council in Scotland manages? So again, just to give you an idea of where it looks on the scale, Dumfries and Galloway is the lowest performing in that it has the highest carbon impact per person within the region. So I appreciate that's a little bit of a bombardment with lots of information and graphs and thoughts and things. So I thought that might be a useful time to pause and just take any questions that might come forward or receive any feedback. Okay, if there's no questions, then perhaps we carry on through.
Sorry, just coming on here. Could I ask? I had probably James would be best to answer this. I had a constituent on the phone the other day, and he was alleging that the majority of recycled waste, in fact, if you said most of it, goes to out the region for incineration. Just wonder if James could give us a thing what happens with recycling waste.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I can assure you and therefore your constituent that the waste that we collect in separate waste streams, so from the red lidded bins we collect metals, well, cans and plastics and cartons, and in the blue lidded bin paper, card and cardboard. These waste streams are sent for separate processing. They're not sent for incineration. The costs of incineration in terms of, I mean, it's not what we would do as an authority, but realistically, the costs would make that prohibitively expensive. Cardboard and card and paper can achieve an income for the authority. Can also or be disposed of at cost. I mean, it does depend a little bit on what the market's doing, but it can fluctuate from being zero rated to bringing an income for the council. Metals and plastics, commingled metals, plastics and cartons will be tens of pounds to dispose of. If you're looking to go to incineration, you're probably spending 80-90 pounds a tonne to dispose of. So, I mean, there's no economic advantage in doing that, and that would be one very simple reason to not send it to anything other than for recycling, and therefore that's where we send it.
Thanks for that, James. Andrew, would you like to speak, Andrew?
Yeah, thank you, John. It's really just to follow on with that. I understand that Oakbank is processing most of our waste in the way that they're baling it and then sending it on to the incinerator, etc. They're not doing that for nothing, and I would have thought there would be some value in us actually doing the process ourselves. Would you not have thought so, James?
Sorry, just turning my camera back on. Apologies for the delay. Yes, Councillor Wood, through yourself, Chair, Councillor Wood. Yes, and that's exactly what we will be doing. We do that at the Stranraer Zero Waste Park. So materials collected at the Stranraer Zero Waste Park are bulked there and are taken on to our off-takers directly. At Dumfries, we don't have the Zero Waste Park as yet constructed. When that is constructed, it will serve the same purpose, as in it will be able to take the refuse collection vehicles into a large building where materials will be bulked, and with the potential for separation, some form of sorting, if we deem that as an appropriate investment. And that again depends a little bit on the values that you get for commingled stream or waste streams or separated waste streams. And that would be the purpose of an element of the Dumfries Zero Waste Park. But as you'll appreciate, the importance for us as a service, once we brought the waste PFI contract had fallen, and we brought that element of the service in house, and thus the constraints imposed by that on us rolling out a curbside collection service. Once that happened, our focus in beginning of 2019 was the rollout of a curbside collection service. So that is ahead of the infrastructure that we have to process, to bulk up and potentially bail. We do bail card at Stranraer, for example. Those processes are a wee bit behind the curbside collection service, but having the curbside collection service in there and operating successfully is obviously pretty critical to getting our recycling rates up.
Thank you, James. I've got a question here for Ian Howie. What time period were these figures obtained, i.e. was it prior to the rollout of the curbside collection? I think they were 2019, am I correct?
Yeah, I was looking to Nick to answer that question, but I think that is correct.
Sorry, I
David,
missed that question, so apologies.
Aye. David Ingles wants to speak. Question, Ian?
Thanks, Chair.
That was David.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, question to James, if that's okay. Given our low percentage of recycling, in comparison to other areas, where do we stand regarding recycling for commercial waste?
Sorry, I'll unmute myself. Sorry. Through yourself, Chair. Councillor Ingles, I don't actually have those figures to hand. We do offer a commercial recycling service and have done for a number of years as a council, as you may be aware, if you or your constituents have a commercial collection service now subsumed or is being subsumed into the general, the council's curbside collection service for paper and card, metals and plastics. But I can see if I can find out the figures of what we've done in the past in terms of a commercial recycling rates. Obviously, what you'll appreciate is that Dumfries and Galloway Council aren't the only collector of commercial waste in the region. So some of those figures may not, we wouldn't be able to give a full picture of commercially what was recycled in Dumfries and Galloway. But what I can get, I'll speak to colleagues about that and see what we can get. Going forward, the commercial element will be included within the curbside. So an estimate can be made of how much commercial is in there. But again, we're picking up, we can identify a size of bin that we collect from a property. And from that size of bin, we can estimate a weight, but it is just an estimate of weight. So we can estimate how much commercial waste we pick up as a percentage of the overall waste that we collect as an authority. But yeah, I can provide those figures out with this meeting if that would be helpful.
Okay, thanks, James.
I'm sorry, Andrew, I didn't know you wanted to come back in. Could you come back in, Andrew, please?
Thank you very much, John. It was really just a follow-up on my last question. And as James said, that clearly we're going to have to look at when and where we're going to be baling these materials and the costs and whether it's going to be viable. When will this subcommittee have that information available to it?
Chair, through yourself, Chair, Councillor Wood, the proposals, so to full council last year was the agreement to invest in the Dumfries Zero Waste Park. The Zero Waste Park comes with a recycler building, and that recycler building, similar to the facilities at Stranraer. I'm not sure if you'll have seen the facilities at Stranraer, but hopefully in due course we can have the subcommittee attend a site in Stranraer. We did that with the previous subcommittee. But the building there will simply take the receipt of all of the recycling materials that are collected curbside in two large bays, one for paper and card and one for metals, plastics and cartons. As to whether we do further processing of that, as I said, depends a little bit on the market. We're now in 2021. That facility is likely to be operational towards the end of 2022. At this stage, it would be, it wouldn't be possible to say whether the market would merit that. One of the examples I would give you is that we have a baler in Stranraer for baling card, paper and card, and while we can use that baler, and clearly when we bale a card, we can get more bales onto a load to take away for processing. Interestingly, at the moment, our offtake contractor or offtake company prefers the paper unbaled, loose paper and card. So we're off taking it loose rather than baled. So there are fluctuations in the market in terms of demand, and there are fluctuations in the market clearly in terms of price. So determination of that will be something in due course. But initially, our expectation is that the facilities at Dumfries will be a bulking facility for these materials. You've also got to take into account that within 1 or 2 years, we'll start seeing significant impacts, and something that Nick will discuss in the next bit of his presentations. but we'll start to see significant impacts upon the curbside recyclates that we collect with the introduction of the deposit return scheme. So with the removal of single-use drinks containers, for example, cans and bottles, PET bottles, which are like bottles of Coke or lemonade, will generally be subject to a 20p deposit and therefore not be in the curbside collection. That'll change the values of what's collected curbside by the authority, and will probably change the way in which we would look to do any form of processing. I hope that's sort of helpful, explains a little bit of the position.
Okay, Andrew.
John, I'll be honest with you, I'm not completely happy with that as a response. All I was asking for is when the subcommittee will be furnished with the information required for us to make the next decision on.
Well, sorry, Andrew. This committee doesn't make any decisions.
No, I know
the committee's committee makes the decisions.
But we are required to be furnished with information so that we can.
I'm not arguing with that, but we can't. You said about making decisions. We can't make any decisions.
Thank you.
Right, Nick, you want to go to the next part of your presentation? Is there nobody else coming in?
Sure, thank you. Okay, so let's have a look at where the council needs to be in the future. So there's 5 main areas, and the first one is that you need to meet Scottish Government waste targets. The last target year was 2020. We'll have a little look at how you did against that in a second. The next big one is in 2025. You need to think about how you're going to adapt to the future changes in the waste sector, and I should note that those changes are uncertain at the moment, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But we do know that we're going to have the Environment Bill coming in. Some of the changes are going to apply to you from 2022 onwards, and we anticipate some significant changes in what waste management looks like across the whole country. You're going to need to comply with the Scottish Government Charter for Household Recycling. Now, that's a charter which you're currently signed up to. The work, therefore, for compliance with that is ongoing, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well in another slide. We're also expecting the landfill ban to come in 2026. So this is a ban on biodegradable municipal waste going to landfill. You're in a good position to comply with that because you have good infrastructure and facilities in place at the moment, but there is a little bit of further work that may need to be done to ensure compliance there. And making the transition to net zero carbon. Waste will play a significant role in that transition to net zero carbon. We'll talk about that in some more detail, but it's clear that the council has made this a priority already by making it a council priority. So it's something which I'm sure is on your agenda. Okay, so we'll look at each of these 5 areas in a bit more detail, and we'll start with national targets. So the current Scottish Government targets, or the last one that was relevant, was to recycle 60% of household waste by 2020. Now, as a country, that target was not met. It's now passed. I don't think anything is anyone's looking back now. Everyone's just looking forward to what the next stages are. And there's a few targets that come in for 2025, so I'll bring them all up on the screen. Essentially, these targets apply to all waste, which means not just municipal waste, not just the waste which, for example, Dumfries and Galloway Council is responsible for. It's also all the other councils, but all other businesses, construction and demolition waste. So it's not quite the same picture that we're used to looking at when comparing recycling figures from a local authority. Nonetheless, that's how Scotland is looking at this, and probably correctly so, because only looking at municipal waste ignores the other 80 or 90% of waste which is out there. So the targets are to reduce the total amount of food waste by 15% against levels in 2011. To reduce the total waste arising by 15%. Then to reduce food waste by 33% against 2013 levels. I should note that these years aren't arbitrary years. They're picked because the specific data that's associated with those years that makes it easy for comparison. Also, sorry, to recycle 70% of all waste by 2025. Bearing in mind you're at about 30% at the moment. That's quite a long way to go, but also acknowledging that there's a lot of construction and demolition waste in there. It's part of the all waste, which has a very high recycling rate. And then there's a maximum of 5% of all waste to landfill by 2025. So that's separate from the biodegradable municipal landfill ban, but it's a separate but augmenting target to reduce landfill. I think as well, this is my personal view, but there is potential for revised targets to be imposed upon local authorities in the near future. This is partly because the waste industry has been talking for many years about things like carbon targets, because at the moment we're all weight-based, but not all materials have the same carbon impact. So in many environmental terms, they don't all have the same impact for a ton of that material. So I think introducing a carbon target is a way to try and differentiate between the different types of materials and their particular impacts, and try and place the right onus on producers of waste. So we can see what comes forward in the future. We don't know what it's going to look like, but we should expect some new targets soon. Okay, so that was the targets. The next area I wanted to look at was the Environment Bill. So what things are likely to be happening in the waste industry that are going to impact on local authority waste. So we know that the Environment Bill is on its way, and it's basically a bill about making big changes for the natural environment. Waste is a part of this, along with many other parts of the Environment Bill. Obviously, the bit that we're going to be talking about today. And there's two particular initiatives that are introduced by the Environment Bill for waste, which are designed to drive the transition towards a circular economy. And these are extended producer responsibility and the deposit return scheme. So we'll talk about each of these initiatives in turn, because these are the most critical for Scottish local authorities. So the first one is extended producer responsibility. So what is this? Well, EPR is designed to recover the full cost implications of packaging waste from those who produce the waste. So what does that mean? So if we consider, let's say, a soft drinks manufacturer who produces a drink and sells it in a plastic PET bottle, it goes to a retailer, someone buys it, consumes it, and then all you're left with is the plastic bottle. But who's responsible for safely managing and paying for the cost of managing that as a waste? Well, at the moment, most cans would end up either in household bins, whether it's recycling or residual bin, a litter bin, and a proportion will end up as litter on the streets. The majority of the routes for these materials, apart from if it goes into an office bin, most of them are going to come through the local authority waste system. Local authorities are therefore going to be responsible for collecting it, sorting it, recycling it, or disposing of it, and all of the costs that are associated with that. So there is a system in place at the moment that aims to recover some of that cost from the packaging producers, from the soft drinks manufacturer who sold that PET bottle to us. But at the moment, it only achieves about an estimated 20% recovery of the costs that are actually associated with dealing with the waste that they produce. And this is where EPR comes in. This is designed to recover the full cost implications of that packaging waste from those who produce it. So basically a new system will be introduced, which will help to, if you like, tax the waste producers, get the money from them at that point, and it will contribute to handling the waste at local authority level and other levels later on down the stream. So how will this work? Well, it will largely involve some complicated financial instruments. There's some different mechanisms that are being debated at the moment. It's subject to a consultation, the second round of which has just closed recently. And that's looking at the different instruments, the different financial mechanisms which could be used to try and recover that money. What has also come through with this is that it becomes reasonably clear that some of the initiatives in the Environment Bill, maybe not EPR as much, more DRS, which we're going to come to next, but they might have a negative impact on local authority waste budgets. And so the government has committed to using revenue from EPR to support local authority waste management to develop and go through this transition into extended producer responsibility. Specifically within this as well, there's going to be a tax on plastic packaging. So where plastic packaging doesn't have at least 30% recycled content, then there'll be a tax applied to that material at point of sale. So it will incentivise producers to reach at least that level. And I believe that that level is likely to increase into the future. So we've learned a bit about what EPR is. Let's have a think about what that means for the council. And it's not the clearest picture, so we'll go through step by step. I think the first thing that we're likely to see is a decrease in the weight of packaging collected in the recycling stream. Now, what I mean by this is any individual item of packaging is likely to become lighter. So if you have the same number of pieces of packaging in your waste stream, you would expect overall your waste stream to become lighter. And that's largely going to be because of the financial implications on producers to minimise the amount of materials that they use and maximise the recyclability of those materials. The second impact I think we'll see from EPR is that it's likely to decrease the weight of packaging placed in the residual waste stream. So whereas the first one we were talking about what goes into your recycling, say your dry recycling scheme, here we're talking about, it going into the residual waste stream. A decrease here is obviously a good thing. So we're showing a green arrow on the right-hand side to highlight that. Third impact I see is that it's likely to simplify the materials that are used in packaging and increase the proportion of recyclable materials within the packaging that's used. So whereas at the moment many manufacturers might use black plastics to package some bacon or something in a supermarket because they think it makes it look more upmarket, but actually that black packaging is very difficult to recycle. Not that there's anything not recyclable about black plastic, but it's not possible to pick it out of a mixed stream of waste, even if it's just different plastics, because of the way that the sorting technologies work using infrared, which is entirely absorbed by black. So things like black plastics are likely to disappear and be replaced with clear or coloured plastics, which are much easier to sort. Some of the more difficult polymers of plastic are likely to be disregarded in packaging in favour of the more commonly used ones, which are easier to recycle. So we'll see various changes there, and I think these are likely to increase the weight of the recycling stream. So it's actually an opposing effect to the first point. So in summary, what this means is it's quite difficult for us to forecast what exactly the impacts are going to be, because some of those factors appear to compete with one another. It is likely, though, to help with consistency and recyclability of the waste collected from households. We should see overall more of that waste being made from a material which is recyclable and used more consistently. So it should help residents to understand better what is recyclable and what is not. We also think it's likely to help marginally with being able to meet waste targets. I don't think it will necessarily have a huge impact initially, but over time, it's likely to change the balance more towards materials being recyclable. Okay, so we'll move on from EPR and we'll talk about the other main initiative in the Environment Bill, which is the Deposit Return Scheme. This is something that many of us may remember as something we used to do when we were younger, where we'd buy soft drinks in glass bottles, we'd be able to have our drink and then return the bottle and get some cash back for it, which seemed like a great idea as a kid. And it's something that for the most part, the UK has lost, but it's been retained in a lot of mainland Europe. Countries like Germany and Sweden have been doing this for many, many decades and implement it very successfully. So I think the principle of DRS is much simpler than EPR, where you buy a drinks bottle, you pay a 20p deposit at the point where you buy it, you consume your drink, you return the packaging, you get your 20p back. But what it means is we ensure that that material goes into the correct recycling stream and into more circular uses of that material. So i.e. going back into being made into new bottles. So why deploy a DRS? Well, there's about 700 million plastic bottles that are used in Scotland each year. And a slightly shocking statistic is that about 12.5 million of them are littered. And the main benefits of DRS is that it can reduce litter because it incentivizes people to actually go and recover their deposit, take the material back to where they bought it from or to another plastic deposit return place and be able to recover their deposit. This should see reduced litter, improved recycling rate, much higher quality within that recycling stream, which is a theme that is perhaps more detailed than we'll get into today, quality of recycling, but it's a key issue for the industry and as a whole, and something that we all need to improve on. And it also helps us, DRS helps us move towards a circular economy. It's something which the Scottish Government has committed to implementing by 1st of July 2022, so it's only a year away now, and we should see some fairly significant changes in the waste as a result of this. So let's have a think about what those impacts are. The first one is that we should see a significant decrease in glass bottles. Now, the impact on Dumfries and Galloway's waste performance in this sense is that you'll have less material that's available for recycling, and that will overall reduce your recycling rate, assuming that all else stays equal. In terms of the finances, it probably won't have a significant financial impact. If anything, it might save you a very small amount of money associated with the collection of the glass from the glass banks, which will probably reduce significantly once DRS is implemented. The reason that there's not a huge financial impact against glass is that it doesn't have a significant value for recycling. It has a small value sometimes. Sometimes it costs money to have it recycled. So overall, this won't have a big financial impact, but it will likely have an impact on your waste performance. I'll bring the next two out together, which is basically we can group these into plastic bottles. So we're going to see a significant decrease in plastic bottles in the waste stream as well, because that material is going to be diverted into the DRS stream. So in the case of plastic bottles, we will see a decrease in the weight of that recycling because there are less plastic bottles in your stream. But we also have a financial impact here where I think you'll see increased processing costs for your recycling as a result of the removal of this material. If I bring the last one up, I'll maybe explain this point about the cost of recycling more. But it's similar here for aluminium cans. You can apply the same principle where you take these aluminium cans out of the municipal waste stream, put them into the DRS waste stream, and that means we have less aluminium cans, less weight of recycling, so it's more difficult for us to hit our targets. And then the same increased cost to process recycling. Now, the reason that recycling processing costs increase is because when you collect your dry recycling material, it has mixed materials. There's plastic, there's cans, and there's cartons all in the same stream. And each one of those materials has a different value. There'll also be other plastics like pots, tubs, and trays rather than the plastic bottles. And all of these materials have different values. Pots, tubs, and trays have a very low value. PET bottles have a very high value. Aluminium drinks cans have a very high value. Cartons have a very low value. So when you start taking some of these materials out of municipal waste, you actually change the overall net value of recycling materials that you collect. What that means is that when the material is separated into its component parts, that processing costs some money. So we have to invest some money to do that. And then it gives us the separate materials which have the values that we were just talking about. We sell those materials and we offset the cost of processing against the sale. So I think overall, if the value of your recyclable materials goes down, then your cost of processing will go up. So it's not a great picture, lots of red arrows on that slide. So to summarise DRS, we think it's likely to reduce the volume of recyclable materials collected from households and potentially quite significantly. It's therefore likely to increase the cost of processing remaining recyclable materials collected from households, and it's likely to make it more difficult to reach your recycling targets. It does good things overall in terms of the environment, but if you're purely looking at local authority measures, these are the impacts that I'm describing. Okay, so the third area that we wanted to look at was the Charter for Household Recycling. And as I mentioned earlier, the Council is a signatory to this charter. And the charter comes with a code of practice which describes the levels of service that councils need to comply with. So there is an existing code of practice, and it's been around for a number of years now, and the council has worked really hard to get in place all the different collection systems that it needs to comply with the code of practice, and it is now compliant, or at least it will be fully compliant when the food waste is rolled out later this year. However, we are expecting that there will be a revised code of practice that's likely to be published towards the end of this year. So we're aware that this is something that we're going to need to review and establish if there are any significant changes in this code of practice which will impact on the services that the council needs to deliver. So I think this one is relatively simple, but it's a watching brief to see what changes in the next stage and what we might need to do. Okay, so I haven't included a slide on the landfill ban, which is actually the fourth element that we had there, mostly because I don't think it's hugely relevant to you at the moment. You're diverting the vast majority of your waste from landfill. The bits which are going to landfill will probably be considered as extenuating circumstances from the landfill ban. And it's around 5 years away, and I think there are other things which need to be focused on first. So I haven't focused a lot of time and energy on that. And instead, I've skipped to net zero carbon because I think this is a much higher priority. So we know that the whole net zero carbon movement is significant and growing at the moment. There's a lot of momentum behind it, and a lot of people are really starting to get on board. There was the IPCC report that was published, I think it was last week, which shows that the problem is rapidly worsening, and that we need to take immediate and significant action if we're going to prevent some sort of major climate disaster. Now, in terms of the council, you're responsible for reducing carbon emissions throughout the region, and I've spoken with your colleague Sarah Farrell, who's responsible for pushing a lot of the activity around the transition to net zero carbon. We've had some really interesting discussions about how it links into waste. What was most interesting is that the council activities, when you look at the entire Dumfries and Galloway region and all of the carbon emissions within the region, the council activities only account for 0.7% of that total emissions. It's all the other activities of households, businesses, industry and agriculture which account for the balance. But that notwithstanding, 0.7% is quite significant. And the council has responsibilities for cutting emissions throughout the other 99.3% as well. We know it's indirect responsibility, but nonetheless, there is an element of responsibility there for local councils. So we know that you're going to need to lead the region to reduce carbon emissions. And putting waste management into the context of this, in 2008, 2009, the waste management service was accounting for 36% of the total council's carbon emissions. Fast forward to 2019-20, and that's reduced to 25%. And that reduction in carbon relative to the council's overall is a genuine reduction in waste carbon. And that's as a result of the reprocurement of the offtake contracts for the MBT, which has seen more of that material go to recovery processes rather than to landfill. However, I think there's still significant scope for further reduction in future years. And I think we can say that with a reasonable amount of certainty on the basis that your recycling rates are still relatively low, and improving recycling rates and reducing residual waste is one of the major ways to reduce the carbon footprint of the waste service. Within this as well, it's useful context to understand that the waste management service of the council is not likely to be able to reach net zero. It all depends on how you account for carbon, where your boundaries are for the bit that you're modelling, and lots of other factors in there. But essentially, the way that it is set up, it's a duty that the council has to deal with this waste, but unfortunately, it comes with a fairly significant carbon burden. Now, waste management carbon can definitely be reduced, but it will likely not get to net zero with the current measures that are in place. But reducing it will reduce the amount in which you need to offset carbon in other areas of the council. So we'll just have a quick look at Scotland's waste footprint to see how that looks, and it's reasonably significant. In 2011, waste in Scotland was responsible for almost 15 million tonnes of carbon equivalents released into the atmosphere, or the equivalent of 2.3 million flights around the world. Now, I think it was in 2012 where Scotland introduced new legislation to help move waste along. And we can see the impact of that to an extent in the 2016 data, where comparing like for like, the carbon impact had reduced from 15 million to 11 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents, equivalent to 1.7 million flights around the world. Now, that's a significant reduction, but also still a significant amount of carbon associated with waste in Scotland.
Can I just stop you there a second, Nick? There's John Young. Are you want to come in, John? You got a question?
A quick question, John. Thanks for letting me in. I'm just
I never
wondering.
noticed. Can you use the chat function? I never noticed a hand up.
That's fine. I'm just wondering if commercial waste collection businesses need to abide by the same codes of practice and achieve the same targets as Dumfries and Galloway Council.
So the target for 2025 is based on all waste, and it's a national target. And at the moment, I don't think it's very clearly passed down to local councils or individual businesses. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to work and play out, to be honest. It seems to me like all businesses and all councils and all waste generators should have individual targets. But at the moment, they don't. It's just this national target. So I think the answer to your question is nobody has any targets apart from the country as a whole.
Okay, John.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
It's fine, Nick. Carry on.
Thank you. Okay, so just quickly on the net zero carbon as well, looking at waste carbon per person, again, 2011, it was 2.83, 2016, it's dropped to 2.04, which helps to demonstrate and remove any errors that could be associated with population growth and actually demonstrate on a per person basis exactly what that carbon impact looks like. And that's the equivalent of taking over 1.7 million cars off the road, that reduction between 2011 and 2016. So it's quite significant, but there's still a long way to go.
Can you stop you a second there again, Nick? Ian, how are you?
All right, thanks, yeah.
Ian?
We're talking about net zero and going back to the amount of waste which is going to be created going ahead with the dismantling of existing heating systems within homes. There's going to be a huge amount of radiators, boilers, etc. Who is responsible for these when they come out? And has this been factored into any of your projected figures?
The simple answer is no, it's not factored into any of these figures. These are just looking at factual waste data in the past mostly. As we look forward, we're not necessarily taking into account specific initiatives like that within the waste data, because we think a lot of the other changes that are likely to be implemented will be more significant than those, so they'll probably get lost in the noise a little bit. But in the case of things like plumbing equipment being removed from houses, it would be the householder's responsibility to deal with that appropriately. And it might be arguable as to whether that's actually household waste or not. Something like a boiler could be considered commercial waste, so it may not find its way into your waste stream potentially.
Okay, Ian.
Yes, John, I'm sure there'll be discussions outside this meeting things, how we deal with these things in future.
I would imagine so. Right, Nick, that's fine.
Thank you. So just to contextualise this against the waste footprint per person in Dumfries and Galloway, in 2019, the measure was 2.4 tonnes per person, so above the Scottish average from 2016, which just sort of paints the same picture as we saw earlier on with the footprint. So how can we reduce waste management carbon emissions? Well, we're quite lucky in a way in that reducing carbon in waste will be achieved using the same instruments as we have available to us through waste legislation. So essentially, we have common aims. Increasing recycling will reduce carbon. So in that sense, this is all quite well aligned. And therefore, I think it makes sense that the waste hierarchy is the fundamental principle that needs to be followed with reducing the impact of waste management. So first of all, we need to reduce the volume of waste produced. So waste reduction, waste reuse schemes, such as the one that's at the Stranraer Zero Waste Park and will be at the Dumfries Zero Waste Park in the future as well. So there's already some things which you have planned and are in train for delivery that will help with this. Of the remaining waste, the stuff that you actually do collect or are responsible for, recycling as much of this as possible and reducing residual waste as much as possible will always help the carbon footprint. Minimizing contamination within the recycling streams. This comes back to a point I made earlier about quality of recycling, which is becoming more and more of a focus issue for the industry, and standards are getting tighter and tighter fairly rapidly. To a point where sometimes materials can't find a home anywhere to be recycled because the contamination level is ever so slightly too high. So maximising the recyclability of the material and the resilience of the recycling system will be reliant upon minimising the contamination within that system. So this may rely on some good comms to residents. Optimizing the processing of waste materials. So you'll have the recycling and residual streams, recycling covering the dry recycling materials, but also any organic recycling streams as well. And optimizing the processing of those can help to reduce the carbon emissions. For example, it could be that any RDF or SRF which is produced in the MBT facility, sorry, these are the fuels, if you like, which go off after processing from the MBT. If they go to a facility which is able to recover both electricity and heat from that waste, then that can reduce the carbon footprint of the processing. So we'll be able to look at things like that to reduce the carbon emissions associated with waste management. We can also look at reducing emissions in operations. This is likely to be much less to gain than reducing waste and recycling more, but there are many things within the operations itself which I'm sure could be made more efficient in the longer term, such as changing vehicles to low carbon vehicles, optimizing the waste collection routing, and site and equipment efficiency measures. So again, I appreciate that there was quite a lot of information downloaded to you in one big hit there across various different things. Very happy to pause here, answer any questions, receive any feedback, or go revisit anything if anyone would like to go back.
Thanks, Nick. Have we got any questions for Nick? Oh. Andy Ferguson, please.
Thanks, Chair. That's been really interesting, that this whole discussion here, and I'm acutely aware that this is a massive piece of legislation, and we're only touching on a tiny wee bit of it here. Given that we're right on the English border, are there any basic differences between the two systems? Because we've got communities in Gretna, for example, who are literally on the border. Is there any potential here for different interpretations which affect these cross-border communities?
Yes and no. It's not clear yet is the true answer. So I think EPR is that regime, that initiative, I think is going to be rolled out UK-wide and will be the same for everyone. And it's mostly going to affect the producers of waste rather than the residents of Dumfries and Galloway. DRS is much more public-facing and has the potential to be different in Scotland than in England. So yes, it could get slightly confusing there. It's not that it's likely to cause any major problems, though. It's just that there's the potential that England takes up DRS against a different scope of materials. So they may not include, for example, glass. They might just focus on PET bottles and aluminium cans, but forget glass. And so there might be some slight service differences across the border, but it's unlikely to cause any major confusion, or and there is some work ongoing to see whether that can be made consistent, which seems entirely sensible to me.
Okay, okay, Andy.
Yeah, because I'm just acutely aware, John, that Scottish ministers have already signed the agreement that they'll work with. There'll no be an opposition to this because it's an international problem. It's not just yeah. So and I'm just wondering how it's going to affect people in the border and that. And there's that. I think the answer kind of says it all at this moment in time because a lot of this is still in the melting pot, isn't it? Just exactly what's going to be put in place in the different nations. And it includes Wales and Northern Ireland as well, of course. Yep.
Depends what comes out of the thing in November.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. Any more? Any questions? It's fine. You want to carry on, Nick, or if...
Yes, thank you. Okay, so let's think about how the council can move forward with managing waste. This is going to look mainly at principles, really, about our approach rather than any specific initiatives, which I think need to come out through this work. So I think the first one is just being aware that there is change required. There will be change required. There's a lot of change coming, and we're not certain what all of that change looks like yet. We'll get more certainty when the legislation is agreed and implemented, but there will still be an element of how the market decides to respond to these things. For example, the EPR, the waste producers, how will Coca-Cola change their Coke bottle that they sell on the market, for example, and we don't know what that looks like. We'll need to identify what the objectives are of us looking forward. What is it that we want to achieve? And a clear direction of travel to reach these objectives. And I think a lot of this comes from looking at the legislation that's likely to be imposed, what the impacts are likely to be, what the targets are, put all these things together and form where we think what the objectives are and how we're going to get there. And then I think there's a framework that's needed to guide that process for change, and to be able to monitor and report on that progress. I think this is important because a lot of the individual initiatives that you may need to change within your waste system might be difficult or isolated and only do, a certain, they only have a certain scope of function within the new system. And you need lots of these changes together in order to create the entire system. And so I think having a framework which helps you to consistently assess each of those initiatives and put them all together to reach the right conclusions and get to your objectives will be quite important. And it'll help with making decisions because you have that framework that's agreed and you can see what it is that you need to achieve and how you might be able to get there. And if you have that framework written down, then you can see whether the individual initiatives that we're looking at will actually help to work towards your objectives or not. So what we're proposing is that we develop a waste policy and a waste strategy, and this will set the council's vision for the future of waste management in the region. And so just to define these terms, these are taken from, I think it's a development of policy and strategy document from the council. So that defines a policy as something which sets out the course of action and general intent. And then a strategy which sets out how the policy will be put into place. And this seems to me like a very sensible way of going about this, identifying where we want to go to and then how we're going to get there. So we think that the policy will identify the key national and local drivers. These can include legislative improvements and council priorities. And then it will identify the council high level, and then the strategy will come in and that will identify the key areas that we think we need to investigate to identify service improvements and optimizations to help meet the objectives of the policy. The strategy will also provide a roadmap for development of plans covering each key area. So I put key area in italics here to kind of highlight just that it's a term that I'm using. It doesn't have a name, but it's just to say that will be a number of areas which we know that we'll need to look at to break down the overall waste service into manageable chunks that we can look at optimization within. So the strategy will provide a roadmap for the development of those plans and then set out the timeline for the development of those plans. It'll also provide the council with a direction of travel of how it manages waste. And hopefully the aim would be that it provides members and officers with a common understanding and ownership of the council's aims and objectives of the waste service. I think this is really important that we're all sort of working from the same blueprint and that we all know where we're headed, why we're headed there, and we need to figure out the specifics along the way, but understanding the direction and the framework for doing that, we believe is very important. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. So thank you very much for listening and for your time. And would love to have any other questions and discussion and feedback, anything that's on your mind.
Thanks for the presentation, Nick. It's been very informative. So is there anyone got any more questions or thoughts to put to Nick? Well, if there's no one got any more questions, we'll just say another thanks to Nick, and we'll go to the recommendation. If members are happy to agree the recommendation that they were asked to receive a presentation on the proposed arrangements for the development of a 10-year overarching waste strategy. Are members happy that they received a very thoughtful presentation? Right, take that as members are happy. There's Nick. We're going to item 5 in the agenda: waste survey scrutiny of bids to the Recycling Improvement Fund, household waste recycling centre hours, and the removal of unauthorised bins. Report by the Head of Roads and Infrastructure. This report seeks members' scrutiny on the Recycling Improvement Fund bids that are being brought to the Communities Committee on the 24th of August 2021 and to provide updates on household waste recycling centre hours and the removal of unauthorised second bins. James and the team are happy to take questions on this report. Have you got anything to add to the report, James?
Nothing to add to the report, Chair, other than if there is, you will see within section, 3.29 with the update on the responses, we have obviously concluded the survey of the garden waste, and we have further details of that. So if there was a particular wish to get some further update on the details, there is one of my colleagues has some figures that can be presented on that, if that would be of use to members to provide the final picture on the responses, and happy to share that presentation if that would be useful. It's just a few slides showing the results of that, but beyond that, nothing further to add.
Yes, I think that would be quite helpful if it's only a few slides, James, and members. But I'll open it up to members. I'm quite happier if you want to show the slides at the very start.
Well, if that suits you, Chair, and suits members, then what I can do is I can ask Lewis Scott, who worked on pulling together the survey, that he can bring up on the screen the slides and run through it, and then we can maybe take questions, particularly on that element. Of course,
yep.
There's a number of different elements within the paper.
Yes, it may be.
To do the garden one first, it might be useful.
We'll take that one. It may be that we'll need to go through the recommendations one by one, but we'll take the garden waste. Take the garden waste one now.
Okay. Hopefully Lewis is listening to this call and he's ready to bring up the presentation. Yep, I see him there. Thanks, Lewis. I'll let you share the presentation and just go through those results that you've got so far.
Yeah, I'll just pull it up. Okay, so we've following the community conversations that we had for the household waste recycling service in 2019. One of the major points we had was the householders around the region were asking for a garden, something on top of the recycling centres to dispose of the garden waste. When we made the report, we had 4,307 responses. It slowed down a wee bit, so the final figures were 4,425 responses. So there's just a wee bit of an update on the figures already provided. A few of them I've added a few extra details if there was other options involved. So I'll just take you through the final figures now. So question 5 was quite an important one for us. It highlighted how everybody who participated in the survey is currently dealing with their garden waste, and obviously the main figure was that they're putting it into their non-recycling bin, which eventually will end up in the eco-deco facility. So the process involved there, in a way, it does compost the material in the drying hall. However, we can't report it as recycling. It'll end up in the fines output, which goes on for further composting and then land restoration. So it doesn't go to landfill. It's diverted. However, there are far more. There's better options for processing the waste. Obviously, PAS 100 composting, which we can go for as recycling. The other 3 options on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint were the 3 better forms of disposal for the home composting, a mixture of home composting and taking it to recycling centre, taking it all to the recycling centre. The other options included the mix of all 3 of the ones on the right, or some other alternatives, and a few fly tipping, which some people were quite honest about, and using local contractors to take the green waste away as well. So question 7 was probably the most important question for the survey, just to make sure that people were interested in it. And as you can see, 4,079 people, 92% of those who took the survey, were interested in a garden waste collection from their property. So the 2 options that councils who currently offer the service, they either use a 12 monthly service, so they just provide the collections throughout the year, or a seasonal one where it stops over the winter months, and then they begin this collections later on, usually around February, March time, possibly April, and then through to October, November. We left another option in here just in case those people would maybe prefer a monthly service. A few people requested for ad hoc collections as well, similar to the bulky uplift service. But obviously the growing season, which guarantees efficient runs, higher yields, keeps the vehicles utilised quite efficiently and offers them up in the winter to cover any potential issues during the bad weather spells for us in the waste collection service as well. The collection frequencies as well, the most common ones in Scotland were fortnightly and weekly. We included the 3 weekly as well. We left monthly out just because we thought if there's limits to how much you can fit in a bin. However, there was a few requests, but towards the end and the other options, however, it wasn't compared to these numbers we've received in this section of the survey anyway. So the 3 options here were the most requested for, with fortnightly and 3 weekly being the most requested. One of the thoughts we have for the service would be to provide an annual subscription for it. So it wouldn't be given to everybody in the region. If they don't want the service, they don't have to sign up for it. The charge would be primarily just to cover the cost of the service for the vehicles, the staff, and the potential disposal costs on the line. It was quite a mixed response here, as you can see. However, we've got 58% of the people who completed the survey who, if there was a charge, they would possibly be willing to pay for the service. We offered everybody a chance to explain why they didn't feel we should be charging for the service. The main one being that we already charge for waste collection in the council tax, so it should be included in the same pot, just similar to why we don't charge for recycling and mixed waste. The counter to that is that the garden waste isn't a compulsory service that the council has to offer. It's an optional one, but we're using to boost the recycling rates and also perhaps help people who've lost capacity in the bin because of the 2 weekly collections rather than the previously weekly collection. We also added sections in here that could maybe highlight the fact that some people just maybe couldn't afford it, and we may be able to offer discounts in the future to certain groups, possibly who receive council tax benefits, pensioners, or low incomes. So the costs we used in question 12 were the range what are typically charged for the councils who are currently charging in Scotland. As you can see, most people take the least expensive option of £25 to £35. As I mentioned earlier, it wouldn't be per collection. This would be whatever season we operate the service over, the cost would be upfront, and it would work out about, it depends if we went with a fortnightly collection. If you went with the cheaper one, it is about £1 to £2 per collection. So overall, we feel it'd be quite a worthwhile investment for yourself if you had garden waste to get rid of. And with the second option being £35 to £45 at 27%. And then at the end, we just asked for any other comments from those who complete the survey. So we got 1,697 responses, and 543 of which were positive feedback, really requesting that we implemented it, or people who've lived elsewhere where this service has been in place and quite surprised it wasn't here, and wished we would implement it. There was also quite an interest in people receiving the compost after we've sent the material away for composting. It seems to happen in other councils where they either sell it back or offer free pickups at their recycling centres around the regions. And then there's just a few other mixture of other requests and comments in there. I tried to keep what people had put in there as honest as possible in the presentation so you can see what people are thinking. There was, obviously the total here doesn't add up, there was quite a wide variety of other responses. They just never hit the numbers of these ones. These were the most popular ones, but they can be shared at a later date if required. And that's everything. So thank you for that.
Thanks for that. Ian Howie, I never noticed you want to come in and a question. You got a question in that, Ian?
Chair, it was on another item down the agenda, so I'm quite happy if somebody's got something to do in the garden waste, I'll come back later.
Well, I've got a question to ask. What is there any restriction in how much garden waste? If I signed up to that, if there were a charge, I signed up to it, how much waste I could get away? Because, as I say, I've just cut my part of my hedge just now, and I've got two rather large what do you call it, ton bags. Well, they're not a ton weight of the hedge cuttings, but I've got two of the large bags to go away. Would these class as garden waste if I'd paid for the collection?
Do you want me to answer that, Lewis? Or
looks like all three of us are happy. The initial plan would be to follow similar services offered by other councils. So typically it's a brown wheelie bin, same size as what we've currently got. We wouldn't be wanting plastic bags in there, so we'd ask you to tip the materials into the bins.
You need 20 bins. I would need about 20 bins in.
Right. So obviously there's the size of the region, the rurality. There are some big, large gardens. It's not something as detailed as we've got to yet. It would possibly be expanded subscriptions depending on how many bins you required, compared to somebody just getting the one bin. So it's more detail that we're needing to look into.
So it's just a bin. We'll need to make it clear that it's just what goes in the bin.
Yeah.
As I say, I made my garden more or less garden free, maintenance free, except for the hedge. So
yeah.
No, that was just a question. No, I just wondering if there are any restrictions. So, and it's just down to a bin.
Yeah, the principal design of the scheme would be around a 240 litre wheelie bin, as Lewis has advised, and that's pretty standard across the country. There would be the opportunity to, if you had a particularly large garden, to double subscribe to the service. So instead of paying £35 a year, you'd pay £70 a year, and you'd get two wheelie bins. Would be an example. But that level of detail is something that can be picked up in due course.
John Young.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the presentation. In the stewardship, there's a lot of self-employed gardeners, and I know in the past they used to take trailers of green waste to the recycling centres. I'm just wondering, is there an opportunity here for the council to process commercial green waste from self-employed gardeners, for instance?
Yes, there is. Simply to put, Councillor Young. I mean, first of all, I just emphasise that anybody operating a business should not, and we're not licensed to accept waste from a business at a household waste recycling centre. So that includes any trade vehicles, any plumbers or builders or whatever depositing waste in a household waste recycling centre. And the same would go for gardeners who are paid to cut grass and then looking somewhere to deposit the green waste. They would require to have their own arrangements in place. Now we're aware this does happen, and it's something that as a service we need to be mindful of, and it's a challenge across the country. But it's something that we as a council will look with member support and approval of how we manage trade waste in the household waste recycling centres. But for those of you that attended the members seminar a couple of years ago, one of the things we did discuss then was the opportunity for 4 of our sites, Stranraer, Castle Douglas, Dumfries in the future with a new zero waste park, and Annan, where there will be weighbridges, would be the option for traders to access these sites and pay for the disposal of trade waste. So garden waste would be one of those, and the rates would be based on the kind of current rates. And that in itself, just to explain a little bit here, Councillor Young, that in itself encourages recycling and separation of materials, because if you load a skip for a company, you hire a skip from one of the local waste companies, and you just put rubble in it, then you'll be charged, quite a low rate because it's inert material. If you start putting other things in that skip, like plasterboard or waste, plastics and things like that, then it goes as a mixed waste and it costs a lot more to dispose of. So anything like this that would encourage people to separate more, and then it therefore improve the quality of the recyclates, that overall the region produces would be better. So yes, I think it is something we can do, but it's a thought for the future, not an immediate thought, if you understand.
Okay,
Thanks,
John.
James.
Has anybody got any more questions on the garden waste?
So Chair, just to jump in there, what we would like to do is, when we return to Communities Committee on Tuesday, the 24th, so next week, we appreciate these committees are very close to each other. If we had any feedback from this committee with regards to the Recycling Improvement Fund bids, of which the Garden Waste Service is one of them, we would update Communities Committee with that information. So if there is anything that you wish further detail on in that regard, the proposals are in terms of the garden waste collection service would be for the council to put in a stage 2 bid to Scottish Government for funding of the capital investment required in such a service. It comes with no commitment at this stage. It would still be we would still have to wait for an offer from Scottish Government if they were minded to invest in that, and at that point members would then have the decision to whether to accept the grant monies to purchase vehicles and bins and therefore roll out a service. So we are in the process of pulling together the business case that would be presented to Zero Waste Scotland and Scottish Government in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Depending on the outcome of Communities Committee's decision to that. So
that's recommendation number 1. I would take it.
Of this paper, Chair, that's recommendation 1. It also includes the section. So the garden waste survey section is the garden waste collection service section is section 3.2. It also includes the elements around the household waste recycling centre improvements as well, and in section 3.3. That would be something that we would also be looking to take forward. Generally, those would be of a nature of at the moment the ones we would look to take forward under that would be the ones with no revenue implications. So, for example, we have discussed at previous committees the provision of a new household waste recycling centre at Langham, but that's one that at the moment we're still doing to service more work on. But extensions to existing household waste recycling centres would come with no additional revenue cost, but would potentially increase recycling rates by improving the number of skips and the like available. So again, sorry for repeating myself, but just if there's any feedback on those two for communities next week, I would certainly be pleased to take that back to that committee for their decision making.
The recycling, they are in the thing, the recycling bids improvement funds. They are on. It's the second recommendation in the communities committee paper. But as I say, we're going through here now, so members. Well, I'm not going to get agreement. If we go through, has anybody anything on the recycling improvement fund, noting the timescales? Well, the other thing today was they've got to submit an interest extension for the Castle Douglas transfer station. Any members got anything they want to say on that? Anything in the papers to note the proposals to extend hours of Jokes Loaning and the Locker Moss Household Waste Recycling Centre? Has any members got anything to say on that? We've got to the Communities Committee. The only thing I've got to say in that, and you know that, James, as I say, for the Locker Moss, I'd rather see the extra hour getting added on at the end of the day rather than earlier in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning. You really know that one.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll note that, and we're still. What I would say on that one in particular is that our intention would be after this committee would be to progress with the advising the joint trade unions of that move towards increasing the hours at these two sites based on obviously the increased usage, with an intention to bring that into play in the next couple of weeks. So early September, those sites with additional hours. So
next thing on the paper that we've got to discuss is the note to approach to be taken to remove the unauthorised second residual black bag waste bins as detailed in section 3.6 of our paper. I think we had something there about as I say, the amount people with a larger household have got two bins. In the past, they've had the two bins in the same way people need it for medical waste or something like that. But as I say, they've got the two bins. They've got a larger bin, but as I say, if they apply, they can actually get a bit, instead of the 240 litre bin, they can get a 360 litre bin, which would just make it it would still make it the equivalent of the extra bin.
that's correct. Yeah, this process is about removing the additional bins that have appeared now that we've started the recycling service. People who choose to not participate in the recycling service effectively put out two bins every 2 weeks, and that has an impact upon our crews, particularly in terms of the additional weights and materials of lifting. It has an impact on how often they have to return to tip, which is impacting upon the route times, and clearly it is also providing a kind of two level service to the public. So some are getting effectively a free service and avoiding having to recycle. And if we want to hit the recycling rates, then one of the most important ways of doing that is to reduce the amount of capacity in the residual waste bin, and that's effectively what we've done by halving the frequency of collection to 2 weekly. But if somebody has a double bin, then that clearly doesn't happen. So we would look to start to remove those. And as you can see, Chair, from 3.6.12, we would have a process in place with the comms team to push that messaging out there to the public, so that they understand what's coming and why we're doing it, and what the benefits are to Dumfries and Galloway as a whole. And
there'll be no question we'll be going on to put private premises to remove bins.
No, not at all. These are bins.
If you read it through, yes, if you read it through on the report, that's clearly, but as I say, we've got to make that really clear.
Yep, absolutely, Chair, absolutely. But also in a counterpoint to that, I would say that we will not tolerate any abuse towards our staff for undertaking the job, and that includes tagging and removing additional bins, which has happened in the past before, unfortunately. I'll definitely be supporting the staff if there's any issues in that regard. So we would encourage, these bins are the property of the local authority, and they're lifted by the local authority. We will, moving forward, be only lifting one bin per property on a weekly basis, whether that's a recycling bin or a residual waste bin. So yeah, very much so. But you're correct in that we will not be going on to private property to remove a bin if we see a double bin in that location. We just won't be lifting it from curbside.
That's fine, James. Has any other member got any other questions to ask on this? Before we go to we've been through the recommendations, so we'll be going to if members have got no more questions to ask in it, we'll just happy to agree the recommendations that we have done today. It was number one, we scrutinised the proposals for stage 2 bids for recycling improvement fund and noting the short timescales. Provide verbal feedback for detail in sections 313233. Note that the office number 2. Note that the office will submit an expression of interest for an extension to the Castle Douglas transfer station to facilitate easier bulking of curbside recycled materials and general waste as detailed in section 3.4. Note the proposals to extend the hours of the operation at Jock's Loaning, including and the Locker Moss household waste recycling centres as detailed in section 3.5. And number 4, note the approach to be taken to remove unauthorised second residual black bag waste bins as detailed in section 3.6. Members agree?
Happy to agree, Chair.
Right, thank you, Ian. Right, I have no other business. I would like to thank everyone for their contribution to the meeting. Thank yous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Right, Chair.